Hello again, friends. So, in the last video, we talked about the difference, we talked about ordinary language philosophy and what I'm calling ordinary experience philosophy for Aristotle, right? What Shields called the phenomenological method. Not easy to say. So I also asked you to read two chapters out of Dennett's book on intuition pumps, right? The chapter on the personal-subpersonal distinction and the chapter on the manifest and the scientific image. So I'm actually going to go those in the other direction, the way they appear in the text. So the manifest image versus the scientific image. It's a really easy distinction to glom onto. And it does a lot of good work for us when we're thinking about, when we're trying to understand how things are. And Dennett quotes approvingly, and I have to agree with him. I think Sellers' characterization of philosophy here is just gorgeous. You know, it's how things in the broadest possible sense hang together in the broadest possible sense, right? I mean, so when we're doing philosophy, that's really what we're up to, right? We're trying to figure out how things, however broadly you want to throw that net, hang together. However broadly you want to throw the net of hang together. Now, one of the things we're going to see in this course is that we get sort of a tension between different ways of conceiving of ourselves, right? So this is so Sellers captures this in the distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image, right? That Dennett talks about. So the manifest image is the way things show up for us, right? And the scientific image is how the sciences describe this thing for us. So an easy example is, of course, a table, or philosophers always talk about tables and desks, so I'm going to go with my mug here, right? This ceramic mug. So how does this thing show up for me? Well, I'll give you a little bit of history behind it. It's a ceramic mug, and it has a top. Here's the top word. And it's supposed to look like a disposable mug. A student of mine bought this for me many, many years ago when I was a graduate student in New York. She picked it up at the Museum of Modern Art, and it came in a box that said, "This is not a paper cup." And it just tickled me to no end, and I've held onto it for years and have managed not to break it. So this thing shows up for me as having personal significance. Which is accessible to others only if I tell them that, right? Just looking at this cup, you may not know, even if you were to handle it in person, you wouldn't know that personal dimension to it. A less personal dimension to this cup is that it has a certain solidity, right? It's got a certain heft to it. You know, if I hurled it at somebody, it would shatter, it would probably hurt them a little bit. And it feels solid, right? Now, if I were to ask a physicist about this cup, the physicist would tell me that it's made up of atoms, right? And the atoms are structured in various ways, and that, funny enough, those atoms and their structures are mostly empty space. So this mug, or my little ceramic cup here, is actually not solid at all. It's mostly empty space. It may feel solid, but at the level of the atoms, it's not solid at all, right? It's mostly nothing. So we have then two different ways of thinking about my cup, right? We have the manifest image, which is how it shows up for me, right? As solid, as having heft, as, being something breakable. It also shows up for me personally as having a certain personal significance, right? So that's its manifest image. The scientific image, the scientific view of the cup, is of something constituted by mostly empty atoms. So, the philosophical question for us is, how do these two images hang together? I mean, because obviously they do, right? I mean, we're still only talking about the one cup, but how do those two images hang together for us? Now, the wrong way to do it, the wrong way to go about solving that question, or for answering that question, is to say that one of them is wrong, right? That one of them is an illusion, right? So, suppose the physicist says to me, well, you think it's solid, but that's just an illusion, right? You're wrong about it. I might, that certainly seems wrong, right? Because, if somebody were to whack me over the head with this, it would hurt like hell. I mean, And for somebody to say to me, well, that's just, it's just an illusion that it has heft. It's just an illusion that it's rigid. That your pain is just an illusion. I mean, that just seems patently wrong, right? Because the fact that it has heft and that it has mass and that getting whacked over the head with this thing would hurt like a motherfucker, right? That would be real for me, right? I mean, that would be as real as anything else. And to say that it's an illusion just flies in the face of everything I believe about the world. But by the same token, I don't want to reject the scientific image in favor of the manifest image, right? So if the physicist says to me, well, it's just empty space, and I say, nah, you're wrong, it's pretty solid to me, then clearly I'm ignoring the efforts of thousands upon thousands of very, very smart people who've all joined together in this enterprise of doing physics, right? So, on the one hand, it seems responsible of me to give credence to my own experience. By the same token, it's responsible of me to give credence to the efforts of lots and lots of other very smart people who have run lots and lots of experiments that are all really reliable. So, the simple answer that I think we need to avoid is to reject one image in favor of the other. But of course, that confronts us with a terribly difficult problem, which is, how do we reconcile these two images which seem unreconcilable? So that's the first bit, right? And so this distinction between the manifest and the scientific image is something that's going to come up for us, particularly as we're talking about the relationship between brains and minds, or bodies and minds, as well as between our own perception of freedom and our being determined by the universe. Now, the second distinction that I want to bring up that Dennett talks about is the personal-subpersonal distinction. And this distinction, like the right, so this one maps onto the manifest scientific image distinction that we just talked about. So, when you say you're hungry, right, it's you who's hungry, right? Or when you say you're tired or bored or thirsty, or that you're worried, any of those things, it's you, right? It's you, the person, right, who's tired, who's bored, who's worried, right? Your brain doesn't worry about things, right? I mean, if you say to me, hey Lassiter, I'm worried about my paper for this class, I mean, I'm not going to address your brain, right? I'm going to address you, the person, the student. Your brain is part of you, right? But it's not your brain that does the worrying, right? It's you who does the worrying. Right? So, the personal subpersonal distinction here is that there are certain things that are true of people that aren't true of parts of people, right? So people worry, people have nightmares, people prefer French fries to onion rings. There are certain things that are true of subparts of you, right? Your brain, your brain wires, wires neurons together when they fire together, right? Your brain is composed of sodium ion channels, right? Your brain, communicates by means of various neurotransmitters, right? So you don't communicate by neurotransmitters, right? Neurons in your brain communicate via neurotransmitters. And so this this personal subpersonal distinction is important for us because when we're talking about minds and brains and bodies, the temptation is to say that things that appear at the personal level just are things that appear at the subpersonal level. So your belief that today is Friday is just something in your brain. That would be saying that what appears at the personal level really is something happening at the subpersonal level. But that seems, in a lot of ways, to conflict with the manifest image, right? If you say to me, I think it's Friday, right? I'm not going to scour around in your brain in order to do any kind of follow-up with that, right? I'm going to say to you, the person, I'm going to say, oh, so what, do you have any big plans for the weekend? Or I might say, what are you going to do for the long holiday? Right? I'm not going to go about running tests, with with your brain in order to follow up on your statement that your belief that today is Friday, right? So we have then the personal-subpersonal distinction as a way of sorting out things that are true of parts of us versus things that are true of us. Now, as Dennett says, right, we can ask this question, right? We know that the brain is an important part of us, right? If you lop off my hand, it's going to hurt like hell. But, I can still do basic arithmetic, right? I'll just use my left hand for my calculator, to punch in the numbers. If you break my legs, I'm going to have a hard time running, but I can still read, Jonathan Swift. If you take away my brain, or if you incapacitate large chunks of my brain, then I can't do things like basic arithmetic, or ride a bike, or play baseball. So clearly, the brain isn't just some subpart of us, right? I mean, if you punch, if you hurt my kidney, right, that's going to disable me from doing certain things, but not the same way that disabling chunks of my brain are going to prevent me from doing certain things. So we know that the brain is important for doing things at the personal level, but the brain is a subpersonal entity. And so that boundary between the brain as a subpersonal entity and personal level activities seems to be kind of blurry in a way. Right? Just think of the example of Phineas Gage. Right? Phineas Gage had a massive iron shaft go through, he went underneath his chin and came out the top of his skull and completely, blew a hole, obviously, in his frontal lobe. So after the accident, Phineas Gage became a very different person, right? His personality completely changed. So, what the hell happened, right? Is personality a personal level phenomenon, or is it subpersonal, right? We want to say that, according to our ordinary experience, it seems pretty personal, right? I mean, we describe people as being hot-tempered, right? We don't describe brains as being hot-tempered, right? You don't have a hot-tempered brain, right? You have a hot-tempered personality. But by the same token, we realize that tinkering with certain parts of your brain will change certain parts of your personality. And so, we have this interesting tension that arises between the personal-subpersonal distinction, which ripples outwards to our to our distinction between what's manifest and what's scientific. Because it seems manifest to me that people have personalities. But given what we know about the advances in neuroscience and in neuropharmacology, perhaps it's the case that brains are the ones with personalities. So, that's all to say that trying to sort out what's manifest versus what the scientists tell us is rather sticky. And one way of doing this is to appeal to ordinary language and our ordinary experience. But in a way, that's stacking the deck, right? Because if we appeal to our ordinary experience, then we're really populating our manifest image. So, to conclude, Dennett gives us some really useful tools for thinking about freedom and for thinking about minds and brains and bodies, right? He helps us distinct, so the personal-subpersonal is his, it comes out of his 1969 book, Content and Consciousness. The manifest scientific distinction comes from Sellers, right, Wilfrid Sellers. So we have these two sets of tools that help us think clearly about things like responsibility, freedom, determinism, minds, bodies, brains. And using these tools to help frame our discussions will help us get clearer on how to get things in the broadest possible sense to hang together in the broadest possible sense.